You know, I have to do this.
Well, we are streaming, but I wanted to put this up first before so people can see you. I have a thumbnail that I did. Okay, see my thumbnail?
Oh.
Okay, so I'll leave that up there for a couple minutes, a couple seconds at least. Okay, if you notice, there's no Steve Leahy up there because I'm not on the panel. Okay, well, here we are. Welcome to the program. We haven't done the. Let's do the podcast intro.
Thank you so much for tuning in to our podcast. Another great episode is on the way.
Ladies and gentlemen, fasten your seatbelts and join Stephen and Jim as they talk about everything under the sun and have a whole lot of fun.
All right.
News, sports, movies.
It's dark, and we're wearing sunglasses. Hit it.
Pop culture, and puppies.
You love puppies.
It's the Watch Talk Radio podcast.
It is the Watch Talk Radio podcast. Welcome to the podcast, everybody. Today we're doing something a little bit different, and I'm very excited. I'm like giddy. I've been looking forward to it. It's true.
I don't even know what to say.
I understand.
I don't even know what to say.
I've always been accused of
being giddy,
getting excited about things maybe I shouldn't get excited
but I don't
about.
think you've ever been called giddy.
No, I love that word, giddy. Next thing I'll say, lollygag. See, I like
Lollygaggling.
I like to say lollygag too. So welcome to the program, you gentlemen. We have attorney Robert Tomei. We have attorney Kevin Dixler and attorney Nishay Sanan are all joining us. That's from your screen left to right. Want to welcome them all for joining us. I'm not going to spend too much time here because we're going to just jump into the show and then I will introduce them on the show. And so you don't want to miss this. We're going to talk about the United States Constitution, something that's close to my heart. Love to talk about it. Love to have everybody. I always encourage people to read these cases and understand the Supreme Court. It is a third of our government. Some would say it's more. Some would say it's less. But that's what we're going to do. So let's go right into the show. What's your name? Jolly Josh. Talk.
Robert Tomei.
Pull up your mic. Is that what you're talking about? Talk. He says talk because he wants to get a feed from you.
Hello.
I hear you. Can you hear me?
I can't hear anybody.
You can't hear.
You can't hear anybody?
Look underneath there. Look at the volume.
Under the desk.
Where the wire goes there.
There we go.
Is that better?
That's better.
Okay. You can hear?
I could hear somebody in the earphones, yeah.
You can hear?
Yes.
I can hear. I'm here and I hear. Let's go.
Welcome to the Trust Radio Network. Join your host, attorney Stephen A. Leahy, every Saturday night at 7, right here on AM 560, as he engages in conversation with some of the most trusted professionals in all of Chicagoland. Enjoy interviews with local professionals dedicated to providing the very best products and services. Learn who they are, what they do, and most importantly, why they do it. Take a step inside the minds of some of Chicagoland's most successful business leaders and learn all there is to know. Every Saturday night at 7 on the Trust Radio Network.
Taking care of business and working overtime.
Now, here's your host, attorney Stephen A. Leahy.
Hey, welcome to the program. I am your host, like the guy just told you. I'm attorney Stephen A. Leahy. I promised you last week that we are going to have a special show for you today, and we do. But first, I want to tell you that this show is sponsored by the Law Office of Stephen A. Leahy, PC, and Open Tax Advocates. Open Tax Advocates helps business professionals solve their IRS problems forever. We help them with audits and levies, liens and garnishments, collections, unfiled tax returns, and payroll tax issues. We also help people with mortgage foreclosures, loan modifications, bankruptcy, and other debt-related issues. So if you have any of these problems, or if you know someone who does, you should give us a call at 312-664-6649. Again, it's 312-664-6649. You can visit us on the web at chicagotaxteam.com. Now I got the commercial out of the way because someone's got to pay for the time. So that's who pays for the time. So I got to give them their time. So today, as I mentioned last week, we have a panel of attorneys. I'm very happy to have them with me. Let me put it on the video here. We're going to start in the middle. Our is Kevin Dixler, attorney Kevin Dixler. Attorney Dixler is an immigration attorney here in Chicago. Remember, all three of my guests today are trusted professionals. They've been on our show. They're trusted professionals. And if you're looking for an immigration attorney, you should call Kevin Dixler, and we'll have his information. So, but Attorney Dixler is on our show. Robert Tomei, Attorney Robert Tomei. He's on the top of your screen here on the left, and my left. Maybe your left too. So Robert Tomei is a business litigator. Is that?
That's fair.
Oh, that's fair. That's fair. And our third guest is Attorney Nishay Sanan. Attorney Nishay Sanan is regular on the show. He is a defense attorney, criminal defense attorney, and he in federal court mostly. Is that right?
Yep, federal court.
He has some famous guests. I mean,
Who we can't talk about most of the time because we've been banned.
That's true.
So we did get the highest ratings.
Yes, that's true. And so, today I wanted to. Last week we talked about the Constitution, and I wanted to have a discussion with. Now, as anybody who listens to this program knows, I'm always telling people, read some of these cases when they come out. Right, they're out there. You go to supremecourt.gov. All the opinions are there. Every opinion from the court has what they call a syllabus at the beginning, and it's a summary of the case, and it summarizes kind of what the facts and then the holding and then which side they were on. And so I think it's interesting, and I always tell people to do this, and so we can understand what the court is talking about. And all four of us are attorneys here in this room, but none of us are constitutional scholars. You don't have to be a constitutional scholar in order to take an interest in your court system. It's that important. And so I just wanted to talk about. Everybody knows what's going on in the court. It's all over the news. Maybe you have heard this, attorneys, but Gallup poll just came out today or yesterday, and the ratings for the Supreme Court, and to be fair, all branches of government, are at the all-time low. The Supreme Court recently, the poll showed only 25% of the people have confidence in the Supreme Court. So I'm going to go to you, Attorney Dixler, and tell me what your thoughts about that are. And is that important, you think?
I think it's important not only to the court, but to attorneys who are trying to advise their clients. Because if we can't get some respect with the law, there can tend to be chaos and confusion over what they mean, what the laws mean. So if the judges are arguing too much on themselves, or if it looks too partisan, we have challenges not only with trying to explain things to people, trying to say, look, the fix really isn't in the lower courts, and so on and so forth. So it's very important for us to establish stability and a more perfect union by having some sort of understanding about what the law is, and for the most part, having rational decisions that make sense to the attorneys in general, not just a few attorneys here or there.
Attorney Tomei, I wanted to ask you about this now. What's your thoughts about this 25%, and is there something that we can do about it?
So, I mean, my thoughts about the 25% is that we spoke earlier today, and you gave that number to me, and quite honestly, I expected it to be low. I didn't expect it to be that low, and just completely shocked, actually. And maybe I shouldn't have been, because given the nature of the political climate that we currently are all living through, and the age of information being readily available at everybody's fingertips, there is a certain, I don't want to say worldview and perspective that I feel like is generally digested by most of the people who access information to from your social medias and from your Googles and from your cable news networks. Now, I'm not going to sit here and get into a debate about partisan politics and different sources, but part of the issue is, as Attorney Dixler has pointed out, recognizing the court for what its actual role is, and respecting that it is going through the legal process and that it has an equal footing when it comes to three branches of government, which is something that I see eroded presently, especially with that Gallup poll. So what can we do to address this? Have more open and honest conversations about what the court's role is, and what the holdings mean.
Attorney Sanan, I wanted to ask you, should the court concern themselves with this number?
Well, in all reality, for them to do the job that they need to do, they shouldn't concern themselves. But it is the public has lost confidence in our court system, not just the district court level or the appellate court level. You're talking the highest court in the land. So you have a public now at 25% shows major distrust. For political reasons, personal reasons, it doesn't matter. The court, to do their job, needs to rely on the Constitution and the law, not what everybody thinks about. That's their job. That's why they were chosen, lifetime appointment, do the right thing. So no, they shouldn't be concerned. I think what needs to happen, as Robert has indicated, is the public needs to be educated on how they make these decisions, what they look at when they make these decisions. There's nothing out there anymore. I mean, even in law school, we really didn't get an understanding of how they do this. Politics is obviously going to play a role in it, but I think the general public who are not lawyers, who didn't go to law school, don't understand how the Supreme Court works, needs to be educated to understand how they come up with this.
Well, I agree with you, and I think that's my goal here today, is that we can talk about it as attorneys and let others think, hey, I could think about these things too, and you should think about these things. So let me ask you the same question, Attorney Dixler, about that, whether they should concern themselves, the justices themselves. Should they concern themselves?
I don't think that they should get as concerned about that, but as concerned about what they're doing when they deliberate. Again, there has to be a certain nonpartisanship and independence, just like you and me when we talk to our clients. Our clients are going to say, hey, I've been railroaded. And then we got to take a step back and we got to say, well, what are the facts? What is really going on here? Right. So if we can't have that, interplay where we can take a step back, the justices have to do the same thing. When they start, bidding to other interests, special interests, whichever those special interests are, don't get me wrong, then there is a certain erosion of trust and confidence in the courts that will tend to affect the majority of people. And that's why we see such a low confidence figure that we see now, probably lower than it's ever been in our history.
I believe that's the truth, that it is lowest. That we are. So back to you, Attorney Sanan. I'm going to ask you about that. The polls are showing what the public thinks. There's lots of stories now about people thinking that the court should look at polls when they make these decisions. So give us your thoughts about that.
It's not about polls. It's not about what the people want. It's what the law requires. I mean, we have a constitution that dictates the laws. And the laws are what these judges, based on their qualifications, are picked to uphold. Now, look, you can have different interpretations about all different laws, and that's why you have, it's a majority rule. Why majority decides what the law is going to be, but polls should not play any factor in this third portion of government because they're not elected. They are appointed, yes, by politicians, but they are appointed based on their understanding of the law, and so polls should not matter. Just adding one point, what Attorney Dixler said is, one of the problems you have now, especially this year, is you had a leak from inside the Supreme Court. How is the public going to even trust that process when they can't control their own process?
Well, we're going to talk about that in the next segment of the show, and I'm going to dive deeper into exactly what the media has to say about our courts and whether we should concern ourselves about that, and whether there should be some fair and balanced approach to this. So don't go away. Join us after the break right here on AM 560, The Answer. free to jumping in on any time on anybody if you have something to say.
There's coffee in
the room.
Yeah, should I stay? I'll
Sure.
get you some.
Thanks.
You want some water too?
No, I got some water.
Should have brought my tea with me because the caffeine tea does me justice, but the caffeine coffee goes. I do.
I'll be up all night. I do coffee. I just drink a bunch of soda.
I do, but it does a different thing to me. The tea just I'm a tea drinker.
Tea?
Yeah.
Tea never did it for me. I've gotten to the point now that I almost like if I really need a kick, I need a third cup of coffee.
Huh.
It's not.
The Red Bull's not going to help.
No, I try to stay away from that stuff.
I'll drink it once in a while.
And I used to drink it. I used to drink it before I would go for runs.
Right.
And I was training for half marathon, trying to like do it in an hour and a half, my first ever, and it was dumb. And I ended up getting like a heart palpitation.
I was going to say that's what
I'm like, after I was done running, because you get to the point where you're trying to like push yourself, and I'm like, I'm done with energy drinks. I can't do it.
Fair enough.
So
I'll trade them in for coffee once in a while.
Yeah.
Especially when I
I don't know what happened with me, but I've gotten really specific as to the teas I like and everything. So it's become, but I got an urge for certain types, like whether they're Nila or Keeman or Oolong or some of the black teas. And again, there's so many different varieties and so many different flavors. It's like Scotch.
That is.
It's like single malts. I mean, if you find it, you
Find what you want.
get that urge.
Trust me, I know.
You know what I mean?
I hit it every night.
Exactly.
Young kids work.
I
Gotta have one to calm down every night.
what are you guys? What are your family makeups?
I hope you like a black.
I'm fine with it. I'm perfect.
Yeah,
No cream
I
for
got
me.
3 daughters.
Never.
$2?
No cream for me.
One's 20, 16, and 14.
Okay.
How about you?
Yeah.
Young
I have
stuff?
a 3.5-year-old.
I was gonna say your kids. You're a lot younger than we are.
8-month-old son.
You're not sleeping, are you?
No, they sleep through the night.
No, I'm saying you. You're not.
Yeah, I'm busy trying to keep up with everything, but thankfully they don't wake us.
I'm an empty nester.
Wait for that. I'm gonna go live with Steve.
I should be, but I'm not. Both my kids still
They
live
keep
there.
coming back.
I wouldn't mind if my daughter came back.
I'm
good with my kids.
I'm actually happy to see them. And Friday's my favorite day because we always get together for pizza afterwards at my
Our favorite watering hole.
Which one is that?
Rizotti's.
Oh,
Big
Rizotti's.
Bannock.
Okay.
So my kids and their friends always show up at the
I
table.
randomly show up.
randomly, and
I'm still an old porno person. But I don't know if
they
I
love
like
to bring. They love to come and bring their friends because Dad picks up the bill.
Okay.
So, but I'm happy.
I did try to get Steve.
I'm happy that they're there. I'm happy. Now let's remember we're having some echoes because there's lots of. So you have to talk really into the microphone. Get obscenely close to the microphone.
Okay.
And we'll go from there. I'm going to ask. I think I'm going to again. Don't be afraid to jump in if you got something to say. I'd like a lively discussion. I'm going to talk about the divide in the court.
I could also talk about some of the immigration cases. Just interesting how they panned out when I get the chance. But we're going to focus on the generals and then get.
Remember, we got a lot of time. So
okay, good.
Okay, so because we're going to do 2 shows, so we can go. We'll have 2 hours to talk about this stuff.
Okay.
So feel free. Talk about what you want. I'm going to direct a little bit, but I'd like to have you talk about some area that you should talk about. That's what it's all about. So let's do the show.
And now, back to the Trust Radio Network on AM 560. The Answer. Real conversations with some of the most trusted professionals in Chicagoland. Once again, here's attorney Stephen A. Leahy.
Welcome back to the show. This is my favorite show. This is the Constitution panel at Constitution of the United States Supreme Court panel, and we're going to discuss what's going on with the United States Supreme Court. We're here with attorney Nishay Sanan, attorney Kevin Dixler, and attorney Robert Tomei, and they're sharing their opinions and insight into the United States Supreme Court. I have something here from the BBC. They said how the U.S. Supreme Court is reshaping America. In the space of 10 days, there have been dramatic changes in America, major decisions that will shape everything from environmental policy to abortion rights have been announced. but not by the president or the Congress. It is the Supreme Court which currently exercises the power to really change people's lives. And given that, I want to focus maybe on the divide in the court. Everybody knows that there's a liberal end and there's a conservative end, and there's a battle in the middle with some of the justices seem to go from one side to the other. And so I'd like to let's start with you, Attorney Tomei. Tell me a little bit about the divide and whether that's important. Should there be some balance in the court, or how do you think that should work?
Well, so the divide in the court, for those of you listening who are unfamiliar with what the court makeup currently is, but it consists of a 6-3 conservative majority. One of them historically includes on the conservative majority, Chief Justice Roberts, who's always been considered to be kind of a swing vote. And since Justice Amy Coney Barrett has been appointed, it's really kind of mooted out that swing vote, that balance that you talked about, where if an issue got brought before the court, it was always a question of what's Justice Roberts going to do. And now you don't get that so much. You get every now and again we get Kavanaugh who makes votes a certain way, which is unexpected. But in terms of the balance versus what we actually have now, I think what you have now is what the Constitution intended, which is an appointment of justices during the tenure of a duly elected president. And that's what the court makeup currently consists of. And just by happenstance, right now you have a 6-3 conservative majority. Whether that's good for everybody or not is up for debate, but it is working how it's intended to work.
Well, I have to agree with you, but Attorney Sanan, if we talked about the divide, but also how so many cases are not divided. Right? So many of Supreme Court cases are. They're 8-1 decisions or 7-2 or something like that.
Well, in those situations where you have a 7-2, a lot of the time the law is pretty clear, and they're just trying to clean up. They're just trying to clean up old cases or lower court level splits in the circuit. You got to remember, one thing the Supreme Court does is supposedly to unify the law in all the different circuit courts and state courts and things like that. So on many occasions, when there is not a split, when it's not a hot topic policy or hot topic law, a lot of what they're doing is just cleaning up other courts' mess-ups or confirming what other courts have said while the plaintiff or the defendant is not happy with a judgment. When you have 6-3 split and you come up with these large legal battles that have been going on for 50, 60 years, that's when politics and policy and interpretation of law come into play. You got to remember, there's really no clean Supreme Court ruling. You always have dissents, concurrences. Everybody wants to get their opinion out there who's on this panel of the Supreme Court. So there's really never a clean Supreme Court opinion. There's always someone dissenting. There's majority, multiple dissents. There could be multiple concurrences. So they agree on 90% of it, but they don't agree. They agree on the decision, but they don't agree on how you got there.
That's a very good point. In that Dobbs had Attorney Dobbs is the abortion case,
right?
And the Chief Justice concurred, but he had a different opinion. So he didn't concur on the majority opinion. He had a different idea about the way that.
But he concurred on the vote, so people who don't understand that you concur on the vote to change the law or to make something the law, but you have a different basis on how you got there.
Interesting. I want to also. Is the court then, Attorney Dixler? Is the court out of step with mainstream America?
On certain issues, it certainly could be argued that it is out of step. Again, when we look at a situation of crime, and I'm sure that Nisha knows this, we have to prove a crime beyond a reasonable doubt. And sometimes the police law enforcement can't do that because people have rights. They have the right to remain silent. So we have a victim, but we have a responsibility to the defendant to require the state to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt. And if they can't, a jury of their peers are going to vote. Well, that has a significant impact on a victim, especially one who may be arguing that they were sexually assaulted or otherwise. And so traditionally, among conservatives, lowercase c, conservatives have said, I don't like this idea that people are, because there is a middle ground to some extent. I don't like this idea that there is, that people can end a life. But what if by starting a life, we're ending a life for somebody? And this issue of ectopic pregnancies, this issue of rape, these things that are significant are now being eliminated by states. And it's forcing the federal government or the federal Congress to step up. And for decades now, and this is not only for abortion issues or pro-life or pro-choice or any of this, not only on abortion issues, but on immigration, the Congress has been totally ineffective, which has ultimately resulted in the Supreme Court, playing a more activist role and making decisions that they never had to make before. And when you have a more partisan, or what seems more partisan to some people, these issues are sometimes overlooked. So in Dobbs, as you know, they're saying the states get to do this, but how far do the states get to go? And I think we may have to go and revisit the amendments again and see whether the amendments suggest that maybe the states are going to do something that they can't do. And again, maybe it's just going to take more hours by the attorneys or another legal mind to captivate these justices and make them rethink, or maybe another panel of justices decades from now while people potentially suffer and families do as well.
Going off on what you just talked about, and for the audience, the Chief Justice is known kind of as an incrementalist, right? In that he believes you shouldn't change the law so quickly, and so that kind of goes by what you're saying, that maybe the court shouldn't look at these things. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying that if you paint a broad brush for states' rights, then you may, and you can do that if the arguments are particularly limited in terms of their scope. That's one thing, but you may be overlooking some issues that maybe you should encourage the attorneys to brief and to deal with, so that the court can provide a more important decision. But that said, remember, it's the issues that are preserved on appeal that's the most important. And if you don't preserve those issues...
Well, I was going to add, the best thing you always read in any of these opinions, that's not up in front of us for us to decide at this point, which means someone at the lower level didn't raise it. And so I agree with what Attorney Dixler is saying. And the other thing I think going along with it is our Congress now is very reactive. They're reacting to circumstances with not always following the constitutional amendments, not always following what the law says. They're reacting, and again, this is my opinion, to get votes in certain circumstances that are happening. So again, the Supreme Court does have to come fix that, because again, they're the ones that say, here's the law, here's the Constitution, you have to follow it. Yes, you can create as many new laws as you want, as long as they're constitutional. And I think what's going on, especially these days, is you have a Congress reacting to what the framers of the Constitution never anticipated. You have a different society, you have social media, you have all this going on, when back then, when the framers drafted this document, it was a simple concept. And now you have reaction, and the Supreme Court has to clean up reaction and make it legal.
Well, I want to get into that. We're going to get in a different segment because we're running out of time here. But I want to get into that idea of originalist. Do we go? Are we supposed to go back to the original meaning of the Constitution to decipher what they wanted, or are we supposed to? Is it? We've heard a lot about a living, breathing documents, and is the Constitution a living, breathing document? So we're going to get into that in the next segment. I think that's a very good area to kind of clean up, using your term, Attorney Sanan, clean up this segment and go wait for the next segment to talk about that, because I think that's a very interesting part. Now, remember, we're going to take a break here. We want you to join us on the other side. This show is sponsored by the Law Office of Stephen Leahy and Open Tax Advocates. We would like your opinions on this. Remember, our republic depends on you. So join us on the other side here on AM 560, The Answer.
You may have seen that.
I have seen it. That's not the Navy Memorial over there by
which one?
The Navy Memorial?
I'm not sure. I just remember the quote came from somebody. One of these days, I saw it the other day and I looked and I said, I know where this comes from. I thought maybe if I brought it over here, or I brought it to somebody would say, I know who said that. But it's an interesting quote and talks about the Judeo-Christian idea of, it being a living, breathing testament and that, things evolve. And when you look at the purely Orthodox, how they stick to it, but then you say, well, slavery is no longer my friend. And then, of course, then you hear some comments recently about slavery, they should, and it was, obviously they're inappropriate. But the point is that,
again, that's why I think that by bringing that stuff up, they're trying to degrade or give it less legitimacy, right? The court, by bringing, we hear this a lot, that the Constitution was a couple of white guys that owned slaves, and that's an ancient document that we're kind of tied to now, and we shouldn't be tied to. Of course, of course, that would be redoing the Constitution.
I don't think the framers meant it. They meant to be vague enough so that the future can interpret it to some extent. But again, you can't overinterpret it. And that's the challenge, is when people overinterpret it.
Hold that. Let's do it, Josh.
You're listening to the Trust Radio Network on AM 560. The Answer. Step inside the minds of some of Chicago's most successful business leaders. Here's your host, attorney Stephen A. Leahy.
Welcome back to the program. I am attorney Stephen Leahy. This is the Trust Radio Network on AM 560. The Answer. We're here with Joliet Josh, our technical producer. We are also joined by attorneys Nishay Sanan, attorney Kevin Dixler, and attorney Tomei. So, Robert Tomei, thanks so much for joining us here, gentlemen. Where do we leave off now, guys? I wanted to talk about
We're talking about the Supreme Court having to clean up what the other branches of politics are doing, or other leaders are doing.
Okay, well, let's start with Mr. Tomei. Tell us again. I wanted to talk about where it all comes from, right? Because when we look at the divide of the court, and we're trying to figure out how to interpret the Constitution. What is the right way to do it? We have originalists, we have textualists, we have incrementalists, is there a right way to interpret the Constitution?
Well, that's a very complicated, nuanced question. And I suppose the answer is derived, and it's subjective in nature to each individual based on their perspective and their worldview and their morality and their understanding of the role of government. And so, in my personal opinion, if we're going to ask about that, which is what you're doing here, I like more, when it comes to what I'm reading from the opinions that have come out in the most recent cycle, it seems to me like what everybody's labeling this as is more originalist type interpretation of the Constitution. And I'd say that I support that kind of analysis. And I understand the perspective of, well, it's a living, breathing document. So for instance, as Attorney Dixler said on our break, that is a reality of the vagueness of the document, the right, for instance, the right to bear arms. What does that mean? What did that mean in 1776 and 1791 versus what it means in 1950 to what it means today?
Okay, Attorney Sanan, tell us a little bit about, because we talk about a living, breathing document. Is the Constitution a living, breathing document in your view?
I think the court has made it, or some of the court members have made it a living, breathing document. I think, and I agree with Attorney Romay, that you have a document that's written and it's vague. There was a purpose to keep it vague because it can grow as society grows. It can grow as laws grow and laws change and the world, opens up to the U.S. So the vagueness part, I understand why people consider it to be a vague working document. I think what's happened is interpretation of certain parts of the amendments, certain parts of the Constitution have to become a living, breathing document because everything is changing so fast in society.
But Attorney Dixler, doesn't that mean that we have then judge-made law and not legislated?
Not necessarily. And again, the justices and some other lower court judges have found that some issues are non-justiciable, and we've heard that term before. That means that they're political and they need to be decided by Congress and by the legislators. So that's a very important thing for all the justices to think about when they're making decisions, whether it be Dobbs or whether it be the case that was involved in Maine, whether they were too activist on a more extreme level, whether it's on the right end or the left end. I sometimes look at these things and I see the so-called idea that maybe some of our justices are liberal in the sense of the issue. So they're liberal about people having handguns, the right to bear arms. Everybody could have a gun. You could have a gun. You could have a gun. So I don't know if that it comes down to the terminology liberal or conservative, but sometimes both sides get too extreme. And maybe even issues. We're more issue-oriented so that some people are more extreme on some issues than other issues. And maybe because it's based on their personal experiences, or maybe it's based on their ignorance or who they trust or who they talk to or who they depend on. But I think there has to be a little more discourse and understanding of those issues. And that has sometimes led to inconsistency when we talk beyond each other, and also when the justices sometimes are particularly immune to some of the arguments for partisan reasons, which shouldn't be an issue. But again, non-justiciable is very important because sometimes Congress has to make those decisions. And our Congress is just not making those decisions anymore. And we've had a lot of gridlock, and this has been decades of gridlock.
Does that cause a problem then with trying to fill that vacuum? You think that's what the court is doing, Attorney Tomei?
So it caused a problem in terms of Congress not being able to
with Congress
legislate.
If Congress isn't in the area, and then does the court then fill that vacuum? Is that the proper role?
I mean, I don't think that is the court's proper role. I think that's clear according to our jurisprudence in the history of our country. But I think that's a separate issue and a separate problem. And certainly Congress has been gridlocked and they've been completely ineffectual. And that's a different problem that needs to be addressed. But I think the court is serving its role.
Was it the design of our system that Congress should be ineffectual?
Well, unfortunately, they are ineffectual. I mean, it doesn't matter if it was meant by design; it's just happening. It's been, and as Attorney Dixler said, it's been happening for a long time. So, yeah, maybe the Supreme Court has to fix things.
Well, we're going to talk about that at the other, and I also want to talk about the Bill of Rights and what the view is on this panel on the Bill of Rights and what that means. So, join us on the other side here on AM 560. The Answer. Because some people believe the Bill of Rights apply to individuals, and some people believe it applies to the states, and some people believe that it applies to the federal government.
Some people believe it applies to corporations. Of course, the Supreme Court said it does.
Well, of course, the Supreme Court said it does because corporations are people.
That's right.
They're happier people. They make more money than all this.
Not necessarily. I have a corporation. It doesn't do very well.
Look at what happened. What was that? The woman just got her sentence. I think. Well, no, that was a while ago. The one from the one who did the blood testing.
Theranos.
Yeah, Theranos. Yeah, that was crazy.
The other guy just got convicted. Her partner just got convicted.
Yeah,
I'm not familiar with that.
They were selling fake blood tests to Walgreens and all this stuff, lying about the science behind it and that whether it worked or not, manipulating the living crap out of the data. And like Walgreens,
I did hear about
Walgreens
this.
almost gave him $1 billion.
This is that woman that's and
and she was having an affair with.
and she was just raising money like crazy.
She just dropped out from Stanford.
Right.
She was having
an
professor.
Affair. Yeah. She was having an affair with the co-defendant.
Their
whole sex life hit everything. It was great. How he manipulated her.
Made it interesting.
That'll be another show.
Let's talk about the Bill of Rights then. Let's do that because I think
you don't want to talk about sex and co-defendant.
Or
is that the next time I'm on?
In the
next show I'm on.
You got to relate it to the Constitution.
I can.
I don't know if have I slighted anyone. Anybody need more time? Have I slighted? I don't want to slight anybody.
I think you need more time.
Well, I don't want any time. I don't want. Let's do it, Josh.
Now, back to the Trust Radio Network on AM 560. Hear from Chicago's business leaders. Learn who they are, what they do, and why they do it. Once again, here's attorney Stephen A. Leahy.
Welcome back. I am your host, attorney Stephen Leahy. We're here with attorney Robert Tomei, attorney Nishay Sanan, and attorney Kevin Dixler. And we're discussing the United States Supreme Court. And I want you. I've always encouraged listeners to get involved in these decisions and read them, because it's so important that we all understand and kind of see where our court is taking us. Some are kind of disgusted in the direction. Others aren't. Although I did mention at the beginning of the show that the Gallup poll has the court at a 25% approval rating, the lowest of all time. But now I haven't said that, I want to talk about the Bill of Rights. Okay, and obviously it's part of our Constitution, and the Constitution is really supposed to be the focus of the Supreme Court. So talk a little bit about the Bill of Rights in your view, Attorney Sanan, about and what that, who is directed? What's the Bill of Rights for in your view?
What was it supposed to be for, in my view? Because it's a little different what it's for and what it was supposed to be for.
I agree with you that, and we're going to talk about that too. And I think one of the biggest things is the 14th Amendment, but we're not there yet. So talk a little bit about what you think the original intent of the Bill of Rights was.
I think it's to protect the people. I mean, we had a little conversation offline about whether corporations should be protected, government should be protected. Originally, when it was first created, in my belief, it was to protect people. People from government, people from government agencies, people from the police, because we know when someone gets too much power, you can see what happens. So in my opinion, it's for the people and not anybody else. But our lower level courts, our mid-level appellate courts, and the Supreme Court have now changed that to where it's a gray area on who's covered. And I think, in my opinion, doing the criminal side of it is the people's rights have been depleted. It's not about protecting a person's rights anymore, because they've carved out every possible exception to protecting someone's rights.
That's a problem. Will you say, Attorney Dixler, will you say that's a problem then?
It's a challenge. The challenge for immigration is that our Congress has the right to enact laws, even rather inhumane laws, based upon the way that it was written. So by further restricting lawful immigration, and that's been done quite a bit in 1986 with the laws that basically made it very, very difficult to marry a foreigner, or more restrictive, to 1990 when we dropped the number of lawful family-based visas to 226,000 in a country now of over 332 million. You're talking about less than a percentage a year, 0.67 or so. When you drop lawful immigration to such lows and you tell people to wait in line for 25 years, they just don't do it anymore. Mm-hmm. So again, we have to look at our laws, and Congress has a responsibility. But when it's so partisan and so separated and they can't do anything, then people take action. They don't care anymore. U.S. citizens, for their wives, their husbands, the people who get into an unjust situation where they don't pay enough for their attorneys, or they pick the wrong attorney and they feel they got railroaded, and then they just say, I'm going to take the law in my own hands, and then the government doesn't get enough taxes to enforce the law. We have a mess. And so Congress has to clean up that mess. And if they don't, then all the courts are going to do is interpret the law as it's written. And that's why they sometimes say the law's an ass.
That sums it up in a nutshell right there.
Attorney Tomei, is that the way the court should look at it, as they're written, or should they try to have an outcome? What's your view?
Well, so I think that's the question of whether or not we should have an activist judiciary or judges that are engaging in what's called legal realism. There's a lot of stuff that's lost upon me from law school, but there's one concept that I did sink home, and the idea of legal realism, which is the idea that you have a judge who is supposed to be applying the law to the facts and coming to a just ruling based on the facts of the case and based on the law that has been passed, deciding that they want to come to a different outcome, engaging in mental gymnastics and drafting some kind of long opinion that's 300 pages long in order to justify that position. So the answer is the judiciary is supposed to apply the law to the facts and come to a just ruling based on the law that is ingrained in the Constitution and what Congress passes.
Well, all of you appear before judges. What's your experience with that?
my experience with, well, so that's a question of, I think at the trial court level, you're doing motion practice and whatnot, or even testimonial proceedings. You never know what you're going to get, particularly if you're in Cook County. But
agreed.
Yeah, I mean, but when you start doing appellate court decisions, and that's where sometimes you feel like a ruling came out is a little bit more partisan, or you had a panel that decided based off of personal predilection about something, or that you just didn't expect. And I suppose that's just human nature. And so I don't know, maybe I'm holding too much of an expectation on how judges are supposed to be arbiters of truth and justice. Oh. I don't know.
Well, that's a big jump for truth and justice arbiters of that, because how do you take emotion out of it? You can't. I mean, you just can't take emotion and beliefs and religion, even though they're supposed to. I don't disagree with it, right? But I try a lot of cases in the federal system, and trust me, it's all there, even though it's not supposed to. Right. So how often does the right thing happen? Not often.
You have to create a record, but you also have to listen to your clients. When you get up there, you got to ask the right questions, but the judge has to look at him and decide, do I believe him? In the law, of course, as both of us know, you got veracity and you get credibility. Veracity is how you appear in front of that immigration judge or criminal judge, or the jury for that matter, whether they believe what you say, how you act, when you twiddle around, do you look like you're lying? They have to make that determination. They're the trier of fact. And in one of the cases that the Supreme Court ruled on, actually, in Patel, there was a finding of a lack of veracity and a lack of credibility on the part of Patel as far as his false claim to citizenship. So there may have been more going on in the Patel decision that even Judge Gorsuch just didn't see.
We'll touch on that on the next segment. Sure. about exactly what, how the facts play in to a judge's decision. So join us now. We're going to take another break here. We got one more segment today on this show. So join us here on AM 560. The Answer. Hey Josh, we're going to cut off that last 30 seconds, right? We're not going to do that last 30 seconds with the voiceover. The voiceover. Can we eat that?
It was interesting, though, that the whole idea of veracity and credibility comes out.
Okay, so we're gonna have a. We're good. Okay, so whatever that time is. So we're gonna do that, and then we're gonna jump in, and then I want to talk more. I want to talk more about the structure of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, and how that. I just think it's. I know it is. It is. Again, usually in all the amendments, right? I can read them. I usually like to read them before I talk about them. But the 14th Amendment's too long. It's just.
I don't know if you want to start with the first section.
I'd like to talk about substantive due process, and then how that works. And I had this discussion with my son Jake, and we were talking about, and it kind of, again, as I was talking about, sometimes when I talk, it kind of clarifies my own views of these things. And we were talking about the Constitution and who it's really geared for, right? We hear the Second Amendment with the militia, and I started getting kind of epiphany, like maybe a lot of this has to do originally had to do with states' rights also, because the states were the ones that were going to ratify the Constitution, and that's why we had to carve out the Electoral College for states' rights. Remember this: the Senate was appointed by the states; they were supposed to represent the states, not the people. And the 14th Amendment kind of changed all that, and that by bringing the Bill of Rights didn't apply to the states. They could impose rights. They could have said that you don't have a Second Amendment in their state.
Look at when it was enacted. When the 14th.
Yeah, sure. After
the war, exactly. And it was interesting because when they did do that,
hold your thought. We're going to talk about that. This is a very short segment. 12 minutes? 12 minutes? What's that?
Okay.
He did something. He did something wrong. It's like 5 minutes. It's magic.
Giant has to run to the bathroom.
That's right.
Okay, let's do it.
And now, back to the Trust Radio Network on AM 560. The Answer. Real conversations with some of the most trusted professionals in Chicagoland. Once again, here's attorney Stephen A. Leahy.
Welcome back. We're here with Joliet Josh, attorney Nishay Sanan, attorney Kevin Dixler, and attorney Robert Tomei. And we're discussing the United States Supreme Court and the Constitution, because you can't really talk about the Supreme Court without talking about the Constitution. Now, we're gonna run out of time. First, I want to thank the attorneys for being here today and sharing their insights to these issues, to these important issues, I think, that a lot of us are thinking of. But and we need to discuss it more, I think, amongst us. And so I think the 25%, and I keep going back to the 25% approval rating of the Supreme Court and how bad, that's the lowest of all time. And I think we really need our government to be legitimate. Otherwise, where are we going to go if our own government's not legitimate? I don't know. Let's talk about that. But first, I want to tell the audience we're going to be here again next week, and we're going to talk about some other issues about the Supreme Court and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. You won't want to miss that show either, and that's next week here on AM 560. The Answer, 7:00 for the Trust Radio Network. Let's start with you, Attorney Nishay Sanan.
We're talking about legitimacy.
Yeah, legitimacy.
So is legitimacy an opinion, or is it a legal definition? I mean, that's the problem. What are we legitimizing? What can we do to help? Because I don't think that the decisions are really where the legitimacy comes from, right? Because when it came up with Roe v. Wade, I think half of the country said that was illegitimate, right? The other said, no, that's a Bill of Rights, right? Now they go the other way. Now the other half is saying it's illegitimate. So how do we balance that legitimacy? Well, remember, it's all based on a law that was created by somewhere or someplace. So it was abortion law that led to Roe v. Wade, legitimacy of it. So you're starting off with a law that's made by Congress or some government body that then has to get interpreted through multiple layers of courts, and then you get to the Supreme Court, the ultimate decision maker, on whether or not that law, quote unquote, is legitimate at the time. And then that becomes the problem, is how you interpret the law based on the Constitution.
Attorney Dixler, does that go back to public opinion?
Well, again, it's one of these types of things where the courts try to avoid dealing with public opinion and focusing on the law. But if Congress doesn't do something about an issue, sometimes the courts have to do a deep dive into the precedent that's been made and come up with a rationalization for what they're about to do. And again, some of the decisions that I've seen, a lot of people have made a big deal about, but if you really go to them, they're really opening the door for further cases in the future. So with Dobbs, I think they're opening the door to further evaluate when it is that things should be done and whether states can do things. And also it may ultimately mean that the decision has to be political. So if people want laws to be the way that they are, they have to vote in the people who they trust.
Okay, so Attorney Tomei, let's talk a little bit about that. We're running out of time, but I want to get your ideas about the legitimacy of the court.
So I think the legitimacy question can be boiled down to basically one simple phrase that everybody should keep in mind when it comes to their dealings with the law and government is the rule of law. And we must all have a respect for the rule of law. And when going back to the Constitution and to the Supreme Court's legitimacy, I think it warrants an analysis about Marbury versus Madison, going back to the original case where the Supreme Court decided in 1803 that it had a legitimate role to interpret the Constitution. The Constitution was law. And the way that the opinion was so carefully crafted to make sure that the court was not undermined by the administration, and so that the court's rulings would be respected thereforward.
Love this discussion. We're going to continue this discussion. We're going to talk about Equal Protection Clause. We're going to talk about the Bill of Rights. We're going to talk about how the 14th Amendment. All of this on the next episode of Trust Radio Network next Saturday at 7:00. So you got to join us. You got to and send us some emails if you have a question. So again, join us next Saturday at 7:00 here on AM 560. The Answer. Let's do it because I'm just getting interested.
Sure. It took you an hour, didn't it? We were boring the shit out of you. We were recording.
No, it's just that you kind of get.
We're on a roll.
Yeah, and I really like that, and I was listening to John Hansen. I don't know if you know who John Hansen is, but he's got a show called Let's Get Legal. Last week, as I'm sitting there talking to Jake about this, he has a guest on, and she's a constitutional
scholar or something,
scholar,
or some professor.
She was talking about some professor, and she was talking about the history, and something I didn't know is that the first several years of the Supreme Court, they decided 0 cases. 0. And it wasn't until John Marshall came that they started deciding cases. I didn't know that. And one of the first justices was running for governor while he was a justice of the Supreme Court. It's like, because being a Supreme Court justice wasn't big. It wasn't that important. He wanted to be governor of the state. That was bigger. I just thought that was interesting. I didn't know that.
Well, the other good thing back then, opinions were 300 pages. Marbury versus Madison is not 300 pages.
No, it's not.
And that's why it still works.
Right.
It's easy.
There's no weaseling out of it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about a little bit about the Bill of Rights and the evolution, maybe where it comes from, and then how it's kind of changed, because it has kind of changed. As I mentioned, I think it was when I started talking about this and I'm listening to this woman, I'm thinking, well, maybe that's what's really changed with the 14th Amendment, because we were talking before the 14th Amendment, New York could ban guns. That law wouldn't have been unconstitutional because they could make any rule they wanted. Because the whole point was to have states have their own rules. You should be able to live the way you want to live. And now we're saying, no, we should all have to live the same. And really, it should be the majority rule, and that's where this is. That's what I'm reading, and I think that's where the.
But here's your easiest typical example: it's the marijuana laws. States can legalize it, but the feds haven't, and so there's a conflict in that.
You have to go back to some of the other stuff that's happened with respect to immigration and some of these rights that took place in the 1960s. The states weren't doing it. The states had the Crow laws, the Jim Crow laws. They were clearly
but now we're talking about after the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment said you can't do that, right? So because
they did it.
I understand, but that's why you can get Brown versus Board of Education.
Well, there was more than that. There were cases after the 14th Amendment that said, hey, you can do it, separate but equal. But it became abundantly clear that separate but equal didn't work.
It's unconstitutional.
But it also created inferior schools. And to this day, we see the same thing going on anyway. In spite of the federal government, people are leaving to private schools, and the federal government's saying it's okay to fund private schools, and we're defunding some of the places. And now, of course, in our right neck of the woods.
Are you talking about the Maine case?
Right.
Because, of course, that in Maine, they don't have public schools. That's why they have to go to fund the public schools.
But they may have had it at one point, but they don't have it anymore. The bottom line is we don't have any. We have real estate to cover us in our neck of the woods. So, of course, in our area, people can send them out to Exeter or whatever, or they could send them out to Lake Forest Academy. I don't know. I just saw in Arizona that, and I think that they just passed a law in Arizona that everybody's going to have their own free choice of schools. You can go to any school you want. They're going to put the money into an account, and you can choose any school you want with that account. Where's that going to give us? It's going to give us some pretty inferior education like we have with the student loans.
How is that inferior? How is that inferior?
Well, that's not necessarily inferior, but parents and sometimes people who are lesser educated, some of them are better than others. But we see, like with some people taking on student loans from ABC University and being stuck with $60,000-$80,000 of crap. All they have, they can't
defending one of those right now.
Huh?
I'm defending one of those cases right now.
From the university or from the?
I forget the name of the university.
Are you with the borrower or the lender?
The borrower. I'm representing the borrower. So it induced a student loan and the application to attend the university in false pretenses that it was going concerning the employment rate.
They had a lot of false numbers about
exactly.
I agree with that.
Exactly. So what happens is you have a lot of people you have your marketing and everything going into promoting this stuff, and some of the people might be foreigners or they might be from people, and they see the name of the school looks similar to another name of a school, and they think, oh wow, it's great, and I'm going to get
Kellogg.
a job.
Kalogi.
There you go.
Kalogi College.
We're going to start again. We're going to start again. We're back at 11 minutes. Let's talk about. Is there any? Do we have a? What would you like to talk about first? Because we have 11 minutes here. What would you like to talk about?
Intros? I don't know. I'd like to hear more about these guys. They're
okay. I don't want that. I didn't want to go too much into the intros, but if you want to introduce yourselves, I'll be happy to do that. Let's do that. Because you guys know more about yourself than me, so let's do that. Sure. Okay. Yeah. And so let's do that. And then we'll go into. Then I'm going to talk about the Bill of Rights, and we'll just this discussion we just had. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. That's why I don't like to have discussions in between, because that's good stuff.
There's too much good stuff, right?
Yeah. Let's go.
Welcome to the Trust Radio Network. Join your host, Attorney Stephen A. Leahy, every Saturday night at 7, right here on AM 560, as he engages in conversation with some of the most trusted professionals in all of Chicagoland. Enjoy interviews with local professionals dedicated to providing the very best products and services. Learn who they are, what they do, and most importantly, why they do it. Take a step inside the minds of some of Chicagoland's most successful business leaders and learn all there is to know. Every Saturday night at 7 on the Trust Radio Network.
Taking care of business and working overtime.
Now, here's your host, Attorney Stephen A. Leahy.
Welcome to the show. This is the Trust Radio Network here on AM 560. The Answer. We're here with Joliet Josh, our technical producer. Remember, the show's sponsored by the Law Office of Stephen A. Leahy, PC, and Open Tax Advocates. Open Tax Advocates helps business professionals solve their IRS problems forever. We help them with audits and levies, liens and garnishments, collections, unfiled tax returns, and payroll tax issues. We also help people with mortgage foreclosures, loan modifications, bankruptcy, and other debt-related issues. So if you have any of these problems, or if you know someone who does, you should give us a call at 312-664-6649. Or you can visit us on the web at chicagotaxteam.com. Now, we've been talking about the United States Supreme Court in the last several weeks. And last week we had a panel discussion, and we're going to continue that panel discussion this week. What I failed to do is give our guests time to tell you who they are. So I want to start there with first. I'm going to tell you who's here today. We have attorney Nishay Sanan. He's a defense lawyer. I'm going to have him talk about himself because he can do that.
I never do that. I like to talk about you, Steve.
That's why I like so much about you, Nishay. We have attorney Robert Tomei and attorney Kevin Dixler. Attorney Dixler, tell us a little bit about your practice and what you do.
I've been practicing immigration visa law since 1993 in Chicago, Illinois. For more information, you can go to our website at Dixler.com. You can also find that I have a pretty heavy presence on TikTok at Dixler. So if you want to learn a little more about immigration and how it works, please go to Dixler at TikTok.
Tell me about TikTok.
Yeah,
because you mentioned that before.
Can I just ask a question? You're not dancing, are you?
No.
I know we just met, and I'm not sure if I want to see you dancing on TikTok.
I know some immigration attorneys who do that, but not me.
Okay. I was going to be concerned a little bit and have a talk with you after the show about that.
To be honest with you, I like marketing as much as the next. You're the first attorney that I've met that, and I know there's attorneys on there that market on TikTok, but I don't know that much about it because I'm an old guy. Mm-hmm. So but I'm hip.
You are very hip.
There you go.
Okay.
Or your hip hurts. Which one was it?
Exactly. Nishay Sanan. So thanks, Nishay. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Nishay, what you do. How do you help people?
So I do federal criminal defense all over the country, a lot of extradition work overseas now, and some SEC and tax litigation.
And finally, but not least, attorney Robert Tomei. Tell us a little bit about yourself, attorney Tomei.
So I've been practicing law since 2012. I mean, it seems like a short time ago, but I'm in it for 10 years. I started off doing more consumer rights law. I still do some of that stuff, but now I'm doing more business-related litigation, suing large corporations and
that's always fun.
And manufacturers.
I help people individuals myself, so I think helping people, and I know this doesn't have much to do with the Constitution, but lawyers I don't think get enough credit for the work that they do and actually helping people. And I guess as a attorney, Sanan, as a criminal defense attorney, you could kind of see how you're helping people.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I'm
enforcing their constitutional rights.
Same thing with Attorney Dixler, right? You're helping people with immigration, and so you're helping individuals.
Yes, we do.
Right? And then and Attorney Tomei, you're fighting corporations. People can't fight them on their own.
Right, that's right.
So I think it's important to understand that attorneys are, I know it's a kind of cliche, but attorneys are out there helping people. And without attorneys, as much as people don't like to hire attorneys, when you need an attorney, you better get the right one. And that's why we have Trust Radio Network, so I can introduce the listeners to the right attorneys. So when they have these problems, they kind of know, they can know where to start at least. Everybody's not right for everybody, right? But you got to know where to begin. Right. And so that's my goal here on the Trust Radio Network is to introduce our listeners to trusted professionals, people they can trust when they're making important decisions. And again, there's no more important decision than the attorney you're going to turn to help you in the time when you don't want to have an attorney, but you need one. And so, but on the last show, we were talking about broad about the United States Supreme Court and kind of how the divide is and how that. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Constitution and the makeup and how the Supreme Court looks at the Constitution. So let's begin, Attorney Tomei, about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and your view of where why we have the Bill of Rights. And we were talking in between shows here. We were talking about is the Bill of Rights directed at states? Is the Bill of Rights directed at individuals, or a combination of both, or the federal government? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think a combination of all of it. But why do we have the Bill of Rights? And as I recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, I need to get rebuffed on my history on this specific issue. But I remember reading or hearing about. No, I was reading that the reason why we have the Bill of Rights is because there was a debate when they were enacted prior to whether or not it was even necessary. Do we want to put limitations on what people's rights are? Because if we put it down in paper and we limit it to 10, then the government is gonna take whatever's not there and run with it 10,000 miles. So we have the Bill of Rights there to protect individuals.
I love that, and you're exactly right. And actually, we had eight Bill of Rights, and then the final two, 9 and 10, were for just addressing exactly what you just said about addressing if we leave these things out, who controls them. And of course, the whole purpose, in my mind, and I want to get your opinion, was to limit the federal government's role in all of our lives. Agreed or disagreed, Attorney Dixler?
It does limit what the government can do. And obviously, they established in the 14th Amendment exactly who is a U.S. citizen in the first section. And although some politicians have tried to say otherwise, the Supreme Court has uniformly disagreed with some of the claims that have been made, so much so that they've basically made the government rethink the census and some of the things that were a surprise to people. The idea of people being born in the United States is one thing, and then the issue of jurisdiction. The jurisdictional clause is meant for ambassadors' children, people who are on the blue-listed diplomats or white-listed diplomats. It depended on the distinctions, and we allow some opportunities for their kids to become permanent residents, but they're not U.S. citizens if they're born here. There are also numerous other rights that people do have that are contained in those Bill of Rights. But as we've gone through, we've tried to take away rights and add rights. Remember Prohibition and how we took away some rights and then we gave rights back again. Tends to be that we give rights, usually not take away rights. And I think that that's a theme that states and Congress have to think about.
Okay. And Attorney Sanan, talk about where do the rights come from? Attorney Dixler was talking about giving us rights or taking them away. In your view about the Bill of Rights, where do the rights come from?
Well, I think one of the biggest things, the rights are created to protect the people from our government. I mean, the biggest problem when the Constitution was written is they didn't want to have, a dictator. They didn't want to have control like when they came from Britain. So it was created to protect the people, and it was created by the Congress back then because they knew that big government would interfere with individual rights, and that's the whole concept of that Constitution, those Bill of Rights, is to protect us as individuals, our families as individuals, from tyranny and from government. And as you can see, as government grows, we have more problems.
Well, I have to agree with you, and I think that as the government grows, and we have to take a more of a closer look at exactly where exactly where those rights come from, and what are we trying to protect? We talked about states' rights, and of course we know that states' rights kind of got us all in trouble in the war, right? And so, we know that sometimes people talk about states' rights. There's supposed to be little areas where you can experiment, right? And if you don't like what's going on in Illinois, maybe you can move to Maine, or maybe you can move to Vermont, or Montana, which would be more of my but anyway, that's what we're going to take a little bit of a break here, and I'm going to come back. We're going to talk about substantive due process, because that's the 14th Amendment, and Attorney Dixler talked a little bit about that, the 14th Amendment and how that changed everything. And because it really did change everything, and the way not only the way that we look at the Constitution and the way and who's involved in the Constitution, but the way the Supreme Court looks at the Constitution, and who they're protecting. Who is the Supreme Court supposed to protect? Is it supposed to be you and me? Is it supposed to be the states, or is it supposed to be the federal government? So that's what we're going to talk about next. You won't want to miss it. We're going to take a break. Join us on the other side on AM 560. The answer. I thought that was great, Attorney Tomei, because that's exactly where the whole history of this thing is so important. I think that people don't really think about that. About the history, about when it's what are we supposed to protect?
Can you imagine if they didn't put the Bill of Rights for the first year?
Yeah, and that's exactly great. Because they didn't want it. Some believed it, and that's where the 9th and 10th. Now, why do I know that? Because I was looking at the 9th and 10th Amendment, and I kind of wrote that in the email to you. And the reason why, because some of the substantive due process, right? So I was reading some of this stuff, and as I said, I wanted to find a good legal document. What am I thinking of? Anyway, some deep dive in the substantive due process, and then I read Dobbs. That's a huge deep dive in the substantive due process, and the whole Judge Thomas. I'm a Judge Thomas fan, so I've been following his nobody Judge Thomas writes concurrences and dissents by himself for almost every case, right? And so if you've read his stuff, you can kind of follow that whole thinking. And now he's like I don't want to say, I don't want to use a bad word. He's living it up. because what he's been arguing all of these years
is now in the forefront.
Now he's found others to kind of join him in that argument, and so it's become law. Even though he's been pounding home on this for many years, and now it's become part of the law. And it's kind of interesting.
What I saw was interesting was for me, being an attorney who's practiced in the area, is where law is clearly permissive, where it says may, not shall. Mm-hmm. And when you see a law like we saw with the Biden versus Texas, where the law said may, it gives the executive the responsibility, the discretion to do things. And sometimes the executive has to have discretion to do things in an emergency or otherwise. But what the court did in the decision, and Gorsuch, I'm trying to remember who it was, but a number of the justices disagreed. Some of the so-called conservative justices disagree, as they said, the words may. May is not shall. You can't go to another law and say, it says shall here, so it should say shall here. If it says may here, it's may. And that's why I was very disappointed with, in that case, not other cases, don't get me wrong, but in that particular case, I was disappointed with Judge Thomas, and I felt that some of the judges who spoke up, like Judge Kavanaugh and Judge Gorsuch, and some of these
Judge Roberts,
especially Judge Roberts, said, "Look, it's may, it's not shall. You can't do this," and they like to do this. And so I was happy to see them sort of point that out and come to some sort of agreement. I think we can't pretend that words aren't there that aren't. But again, you got to read the decisions and you got to be able to interpret for yourself.
I really like I like reading all the decisions because, and I like when there's the disagreements in the court. Where they, in the dissent they say this, but this is why they're wrong. I just love that kind of stuff.
It can be interesting. But what's fascinating too in some of the cases is sometimes when you're involved in a particular practice area, you see things that the justices don't see. You see some things that maybe the attorneys saw in their briefs, both sides, but they didn't come out in the decision. And you begin to sort of say, well, why didn't they just say this?
Yeah.
And you could have put it away.
So
you didn't have to go into this.
One of the worst things in the world is for the Supreme Court to make a bankruptcy case. There's only a couple of bankruptcy Supreme Court cases, but they don't
understand it.
They don't understand.
Their clerks don't understand it. Let's rephrase this. Their clerks don't understand it.
A simple case to some extent taken to extremes, but it was. And I don't know that they really resolved anything because as long as there's an Administrative Procedures Act, there's going to be officers who are going to do utterly reckless and willful wanton things, and they just have to be put in check. And Congress said so. So justices,
I don't have anything. I wanted to talk about substantive due process. I don't know if anybody's comfortable with that. Are you comfortable with that?
I'm comfortable with some of that stuff.
Okay. And so I wanted
chime in where I can.
Let's see if
please do.
Substantive. Here it is. I just want to make sure people understand what that is because I don't think people understand what it is.
Right.
You hear it all the time, and and of course that's the whole line of cases. And this way I have to.
I'll be happy to.
Sometimes I have to scratch my head when I hear people saying, like for Dobbs, people say, the court is putting their own views on the country, and I think, how can that be if they're sending it back to the states and the states are supposed to decide? The court could have said that abortion is illegal all the time because it's life. And life is protected, and they could have protected life all the time and said abortion is illegal, but they didn't do that. And although they could have done that, and so again, and this is where Judge Thomas kind of goes off and he mentions Oberthal and Lawrence and these other cases that are based on substantive due process. Although he does bring up, were you and I talking about that? He does bring up the Privileges Act, the privileges and immunities in the in the 14th Amendment. Says, well, maybe we could fill it in that. It makes more sense in that sense than making it up under substantive due process. So I just so we'll talk a little bit about that. Let's do it, Josh.
And now, back to the Trust Radio Network on AM 560. The Answer. Real conversations with some of the most trusted professionals in Chicagoland. Once again, here's attorney Stephen A. Leahy.
Hey, welcome back. This is the Trust Radio Network on AM 560. The Answer. We're here with Joliet Josh. It's not his show yet, but he's working. We're here with attorney Robert Tomei, attorney Nishay Sanan, attorney Kevin Dixler, and we're discussing important issues, right? The United States Constitution and the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, we were talking about the Bill of Rights and where that came from, and the history kind of behind it. What we know, we're not the constitutional scholars. And you don't have to be a constitutional scholar to understand and try to read this stuff. As I mentioned, I always encourage people, read at least the syllabus of these cases. If you hear a case combined, you think, how did they come up with that idea? Read the syllabus. You don't have to read the whole case, but the syllabus is a summary of the case, and you'll understand. Some of these judges are very good at writing. Some judges write for people. Some judges write for judges. Some judges write for other lawyers. But some judges write for people. Gorsuch, I think, is very good at writing for everybody can kind of understand. I think Judge Thomas is very good at writing decisions that everybody can understand, that make sense. One of the things that was big in this last session was Judge Thomas had mentioned some of these other past laws, decisions, I should say. Oberfeld, which was the gay marriage law. Lawrence, which was the gay rights, whether you can engage in homosexual activity. And there's other laws that are really based on what they call substantive due process, and I don't think a lot of people understand what that is. So I'm going to read a definition. Okay? The substantive due process is the principle that the Fifth and the 14th Amendments protect fundamental rights from government interference. Specifically, the Fifth and 14th Amendments prohibit the government from depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay, that's where Roe v. Wade came from. For instance, they said, well, wait a minute. One of the rights of liberty, one of the liberty rights, is privacy, and so privacy. We should have the privacy to make our own decisions about our body, and so that's where that comes from. So I don't know. Someone wants to chime in about substantive due process and the 14th Amendment. Jump in.
Well, for the most part, it's about interpreting the law, and that's what Roe came down to, and whether the law was constitutional or unconstitutional in the end. But besides issues of constitutionality of law, sometimes the federal courts have to jump in and interpreting law and looking at the facts. Sometimes the parties on both sides will agree on a certain set of facts, that those exist, and then they'll say, one side will say, according to this law, those facts do not qualify as a conviction or disqualify someone from immigrating, and then the courts have to interpret substantive. That's the meat and potatoes, what Congress enacted, what the legislatures enacted. And so we look at that from that standpoint. And there's a certain way of interpreting that, which is very interesting, that the federal courts have done too, with something called Chevron deference, which is when we look at the decider, the administrative agency or the courts below, when we say to ourselves, is this a reasonable interpretation of those laws? How reasonable is this? Is this good enough? Or is it so egregious? Is it such a terrible interpretation of the law that we have to step in and say the law doesn't say that and send it back to the administrative agencies in this case? Because when we talk about Chevron deference, like we talk about in that law, we're dealing with administrative agencies, which is what I deal with in immigration. So that's kind of substantive in a nutshell.
Well, the administrative is a little bit different in my mind in that about where that comes from. That's why some people will say it's kind of made up, because substantive law, like we talk about privacy, in the Constitution, there's nothing about privacy, is there?
No, there isn't.
No.
But here's something you got to ask yourself, following what Attorney Dixler said. What does due process mean then? And who gets to define that term? I mean, there's the dictionary definition of due process, but how many times have the courts come in and tried to define what falls under due process? So now you're dealing with substantive and due process.
Well, there's procedural due process also.
Right. But so the issue becomes is who's going to define due process now? The Supreme Court?
Well, procedural due process is the process of getting to a decision, and whether the courts or the judges short-circuited it. Was the process of how you derive the decision? Did the courts violate the defendant's civil right or criminal rights or civil rights?
Isn't that where we got the Miranda rights?
Well, but look what the courts have done. There's exceptions to everything now. So you have an amendment that gives you rights, search and seizure. Do you know how many courts have diluted your right for the police or the FBI to have to go get a search warrant? It's been completely destroyed. You really don't have a right to not be searched anymore. They can come search you whenever they want because exceptions have been carved out in every possible way. And guess who that benefits? The government, not the individual. So we took a right that was given to an individual and have completely took it away.
Well, again, I don't know that it's complete, but you as a criminal attorney might find that there are issues and situations where your clients are deprived. One of the things I think about that they used to have, and you know about this, is when they used to stop people on the roads for DUIs, they'd have like these roadblocks. And as you know, there's a decision about that preventing them from doing that. In fact, I remember more recently there was a situation in Lincolnwood, and they litigated it, and they said you can't do that.
Right. But if you go back to what was the original thought process of not allowing government into your house without a search warrant, there's been more litigation and laws against that amendment than people actually following it. Now, I can tell you my experience in 25 years, I think I've seen very few search warrants actually being issued, or the guy was running into a building, I had to follow it, because every cop knows, or FBI agent knows, that's an exception. So we can use it. Because the courts have carved that out. So whose due process do we care about?
Again, I think in the end, and again, I used to prosecute, but I certainly have to deal with people who have criminal convictions.
Oh yeah,
so
immigration all the time. I have to deal with it sometimes.
So I get it, and I communicate and I work with criminal defendants and criminal defense attorneys. The big thing about these carving out statutes is facts and credibility and veracity of the witness. But in criminal cases, as you know, they have the right to remain silent.
Right.
And that's something that a criminal defense attorney has to really think about, because the state has the burden. And the best part about our system is they have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, don't they?
They do, but that's been depleted too, in my opinion. Given doing this for so long, it's become, at least in the federal system, it's guilty until proven innocent now.
Do you think that it's more of a societal challenge that we have with people not appreciating our system of laws and the burden of proof that exists?
No, I think it's a governmental win at all cost. They have to win at all cost. Why else would you have a 98% conviction rate in the federal system?
We have a lot of settlements, though.
No, but even that. But why? Because the deck is stacked against a criminal defendant, because the individual rights have been depleted.
Do 90% of the cases in criminal court get decided by plea bargaining?
In federal court, it's probably about 90 and 10% go to trial. But then again, because it's so stacked, look, you could file a motion saying it was an illegal search. You're going to lose in the federal system because it's stacked against you. So again, whose due process are we protecting? The federal government's? When did we give them due process rights?
I think this is an amazing. I love this discussion because, again, it does come down to who are
we protecting?
Who is our Constitution supposed to protect? You know, what is it wrong? And you know what's going on with the courts. If you read the news now, and we talk about minority rights, because there's all this talk about the Electoral College is wrong, and therefore because the Electoral College is wrong, and they put the president in office with minority votes, and then that president gets to appoint the justices, and then the justices are illegitimate because they're not
majority rule. They're not majority rule.
That's correct. And so should our whole society be governed by the majority, or should the states, which is what I think the original concept was that should the states have their own cultural, or should we all have the same? I don't know. What do you think, Attorney Tomei?
Well, so forgive me if I was listening to about half your question, but essentially what I heard you ask me was what is my opinion in terms of the role of democracy versus a republic and a representative government.
Exactly.
And so it's my opinion that what we have and what we've intended to have here is a representative republic, where we have local systems of government controlling or having say in most people's day-to-day lives, more so than coming from Washington, D.C. That's the way it's supposed to work.
Okay. Keep that in mind, because we're going to talk about that at the other side of this break, because I think that's fascinating, and it's actually what the Constitution says. So we're going to take a break. You're going to join us on the other side. We're going to join again with Attorney Tomei on the other here on AM 560. The Answer. Walsh, and this is why I was talking about him, because, as I said, I don't generally tweet or anything, and I do a podcast and I put it on Twitter every day.
Is this for me?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. and I put it on Twitter every day. And so I go to. That's the only time I go to Twitter, and because I don't do it very often, I don't follow very many people. But Joe Walsh I do follow. But every day I kind of read him, and I kind of pass off on him. But yesterday he had a tweet that said that he had the conservative argument for getting rid of the Electoral College. I don't think there is such an argument.
Right.
And I said, well, you're going to forego our republic for a majority rule. That's just crazy in my mind. I think it's just crazy. I understand that's the pervasive opinion in mainstream media.
Well, I mean, I actually support the Electoral College, so you understand. And I think that you have to have a geographic representation.
Because you won't otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. But the challenge that takes place, unfortunately, and the courts tried to resolve last century.
Stop.
Sorry.
No, I love it. That's why. Let's do it, Josh. Sorry.
You're listening to the Trust Radio Network on AM 560. The Answer. Step inside the minds of some of Chicago's most successful business leaders. Here's your host, attorney Stephen A. Leahy.
Hey, welcome back to the show. I shouldn't have so much fun, but I do. That's why we have the radio show.
Giddy. In years. It's been years since I've seen you this giddy.
I am giddy. This stuff excites me because it's the basis of our society, and this talk about majority rule or getting rid of the Electoral College, or somehow the president is illegitimate if he doesn't get the majority of votes, and then that all works out to, because then the president gets to appoint the justices. It just, again, this talk, I just love to talk about it and to clarify it for everyone. And I want to thank you so much for joining us today. We're here with Joliet Josh, our technical producer, attorney Nishay Sanan, attorney Tomei, and attorney Dixler. We're talking about the Constitution and how and its effect on America, and where all that comes from. Before we left for the break, and one of the problems is sometimes we talk during the break, and I try not to because there's so much good stuff.
Well, I think Attorney Tomei brought up a great topic in your last segment about the democracy versus the republic, and I think that's where you wanted to.
Exactly, absolutely. And so I know we were talking, Attorney Dixler. You were kind of talking in between this about because you were saying, well, you agree with the Electoral College, or you support, but so many don't nowadays. Is that right?
I don't know that they don't, as much as they don't appreciate how it's supposed to work and how it currently works. And again, it has to do with the fact that we have a vast nation, and a lot of the areas of our country, unfortunately, are decreasing, and we're having superpopulations into the cities. I think it's a function of ignorance, prejudice, sometimes even our selfishness. Sometimes, but in the end, people self-preserve, and if they feel uncomfortable in the area, they can move.
I want to talk about that because that's kind of what the Republic is about, isn't it? Is that you don't like what's going on in Illinois? Go to Tennessee, right? But if we aren't allowed to create our own way of life in different states, well, then you can't go anywhere.
Well, then why even have states?
Well, that's where it comes out to. And I've read
there are those who say that.
I have read many arguments who say maybe we shouldn't have states. Maybe we should all have the same.
The population is really a situation of flux, and the challenge that the United States has to create a more perfect union is to have more people in more areas and be more diversified. And I think that by limiting certain things, like in my practice, for example, there were years when people would come to the United States and they would establish themselves in Indiana and Montana, anywhere they could, because they were so happy to be here. And so many of these people now can no longer lawfully immigrate that it's depleted the population circa 2000 2022. For example, other countries have much higher populations than the United States. And if we expect to have a population that's going to be able to compete in this world, we need to have the best and the brightest and the most industrious, the people who really want to be here, working and living here. And of course, they want to do it lawfully. But if we limit our population, as I mentioned earlier, to the lawful people to 226,000 per year for family-based, families are going to get frustrated and upset. If we affect labor certifications to screw business and employment, where people are industrious and employers want them, corporations want them, we'd say to the corporations, oh, well, you got to prove all this stuff and jump through all these hoops. Well, they're not going to hire these people, but they're not going to have as many movers and shakers. India's going to have them. China's going to have them. Canada's going to have them. Great Britain.
Well, that's a different question, I think, about who gets in the country rather than how many get in the country.
But going back to what Attorney Dixler was talking about is where do they end up living? Back in the big cities, because that's where the demand for those jobs are. So then you go back to, if you get rid of the Electoral College, who's going to be picking government? The 3 or 4 biggest states in the country.
I think that we have to look at how our Congress, not necessarily us as attorneys or anybody else, but I think as Congress has to look at why so many people are concentrating in cities and why they aren't living in other areas where they could be and enjoying life more, and why Americans and civil rights are the way that they are in our country circa 2022.
Well, I think if we look at the population from Illinois, our own state, there's some debate. I know our governor has come out and said, no, we're not losing population. I think it's clear that we are losing population. But again, isn't that what we're supposed to be able to do, is move? You don't like what's here, pick up and move. And that's supposed to be the system. That
was supposed to be what it was designed for. That's why we have the republics.
We go back to Attorney Tomei's and when you were talking about the history about where it's from. Let
me interject for a moment about this population loss, because we had a situation where we had a recent census and it wasn't quite run the way it could have been. Now, there certainly could have been losses, but the challenge is if you scare people. Our government is supposed to run by the people, for the people. There's no distinction between the people. They can't vote, obviously. If you're not a U.S. citizen, you can't vote. But we're trying to represent the population that's in areas. And so that's where the Electoral College comes with these numbers and everything. So the challenge is really trying to represent the people. If we don't count the people, we can't represent the people.
Well, look, we're gonna pick up on that on the other side, because there's then who does our government represent? The people or their citizens? And that's a very good question. And that's what we're going to pick up on the other side. You won't want to miss this. You listen to our messages, the commercial messages. They're paying for the air. That's why we're here. So don't forget, listen to them. Come right back, though, because we're going to pick up our discussion right where we left off here on AM 560. The Answer. I'm not supposed to have an opinion.
This is your show. It is your opinion.
I know, but I'm trying to be.
I'm trying to be careful, about that. But
it's fine.
You should jurisdiction.
I love. That's I wanted diverse opinions. That's what it's all about. We don't all think the same. Again, if you read the news, there's they just mentioned about conservative Joe Walsh talking about getting rid of the Electoral College. It's so widespread now that it's become the mainstream to get rid of the Electoral College. It's like, well, of course the Electoral College.
Not the issue to me. The issue's far deeper than.
I understand.
But here's my question.
I concur with you.
But here's my question. And you got little kids in school. Mine are that high school level.
Not even in school.
Not in school, but they don't even teach that anymore. My kids have no clue how the Electoral College works. I had to explain it to them in the last election.
Because we're in 8th grade,
right? But they don't educate the kids anymore because it's a hot topic.
What about
it's terrible?
In 8th grade, they teach them to memorize the terms of the Bill of Rights, basically, and that's it.
Nothing else.
Do we discuss how this actually works in application?
They're too scared to.
I think that in the past, and again, I can't speak for everybody because remember, I went to Edgewood Junior High School and I went to Hamlet Park High School, so I'm just a local yokel.
My kids are at Highland Park. One of them's at Highland Park High School.
So when I had to take the citizenship, the constitutional thing in junior high school,
grade, I think.
8th grade, and also in junior when you're in high school.
Yeah, you got to take civics. You got to take civics now.
Take the test and pass it.
I didn't really go to high school.
People, yeah.
Well, you were drinking.
Like
yeah, and it was the 70s.
I understand. My colleague Ari Trubit, Ari Trubit. There you go.
Okay. Before we get back into the show, I want to say, and I'm fascinated with this argument about states' rights, personal rights, and I don't want to keep going back to that because I don't want to talk about it, although that's what I want to talk about, if you know what I mean.
Sure.
Because again, this was when we talk about, as you talked about, Attorney Tomei, about why do we have the 9th and 10th Amendment, and then how that worked into the 14th Amendment when they said, well, look, the 9th and 10th Amendment says that all of this stuff that was supposed to be left to the people is now part of the federal government. And now the federal government, as you've pointed out, Attorney Sanan, has kind of taken over, and it's exactly opposite of what it was supposed to be. But, and here's the thing, they saw it coming, right? Our founders, they kind of knew this was going to happen, and here we are.
I had an interesting thought just amongst us, and this is something to think about because we get it. You get it. I get it. He gets it. When you have a client, and you get a phone call from the client, and they ask you how much do you charge for a criminal case, and you're thinking, what is it? Is it a murder case? Is it just a petty theft case? Yeah. What the hell? I mean,
if they're calling me, it's going to be a large number. So it'll be a high. There's no petty going on in my world.
You have your intake people, right?
No, I'm the intake person.
Oh, there you go.
I screen everything myself and say, sorry, here's my associate's number.
There you go. Exactly.
He does a lot of white collar crime in federal court. And it's like, as a tax attorney, right? We talking about this Build Back Better plan and the right of the federal government to go into our bank accounts and look at our bank accounts every year, right, and report it. And these are information returns, and that's what cut down on people not paying their taxes. And I always liken it to we can get rid of if we just let the police come into our homes and look around,
right,
crime would go down. But at what cost?
Well, or cops be shot. That's the other side of it. You got to realize there's two sides to that.
I agree with that. But of course they would limit. When that happens, right? They come down on the people who shoot the guy.
Right. Still, but it's going to happen.
We announced ourselves. Right. We did. I didn't hear you. That's Breonna Taylor.
I was in the shower.
Right.
Didn't hear nothing.
That's the Breonna Taylor argument. Right. And of course I'm one to believe that the police shouldn't be knocking down everybody's door to come in. Just my opinion.
I understand. I have sympathies there, but as I said before, sometimes warrants are there, and also there's the people who let people in voluntarily, and when people consent to a search.
That's an interesting word, voluntary. We can have two shows on that.
As you know, there are two sides to every story.
I'm not disagreeing. That's why I said we can have a good show on that one day.
Voluntary. Well,
the credibility of the police
consent
officer
and consent.
The credibility of a police officer has to be tested.
Yeah, every judge rubber stamps the credibility of a cop.
I don't remember where we left off.
I love cross-examination.
I don't remember where we left off.
And when I first got out, when I first started being a prosecutor,
I hate to talk in between because I always forget where we left. I don't know where we left.
I mean, I love doing what you did. I had fun with it.
Where we left off.
You understand?
No, I get it.
I don't remember where I left off. Is this the third segment or fourth segment?
I'll tell you a funny story about INS. How I basically did a perfect impeachment from what the idea.
He's gonna play where we left off.
People who let people in voluntarily. And
there's then who does our government represent? The people or their citizens? And that's a very good question. And that's what we're going to pick up on the other side. You won't want to miss it. Who does the government represent? What did I say? The people?
The Constitution. Who's the Constitution protect?
The people or the citizens?
Okay. Or the government? Or the states, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, back to the Trust Radio Network on AM 560. Hear from Chicago's business leaders. Learn who they are, what they do, and why they do it. Once again, here's attorney Stephen A. Leahy.
Welcome back to the program. I hope you're having as much fun as I am. That's probably not true. Nobody's having as much fun as I am. We're here with Joliet Josh. I don't know if Nishay Sanan is having as much fun as I am.
I've just never seen you so giddy. I'm happy inside. My heart's trickling for you.
Attorney Dixler. And are you having fun, Attorney Dixler? And Attorney Tomei. Welcome back. We were talking about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and who should be protected? Are we protecting the citizens? Are we protecting people? Are we protecting the government, the states, or
corporations, businesses?
Corporations. So I don't know who wants to pick up on that.
Well, I could pick up a little more because you said citizens or the people. There are green card holders who are lawfully present and visa holders who are lawfully present. When they become victims of a crime, they're entitled to the protections that we have, in fact, in immigration law. If they're a cooperative witness, and this is the key, cooperative witness who was victimized, and if they have enough credibility, the government needs them to testify. And that becomes a subject of contention with some criminal defense attorneys. But for the most part, people are wronged who are not necessarily citizens, and we try to do what we can for them. And there are also permanent residents who are accused of crimes, and they are entitled to due process just like everybody else is.
That's correct, because if they are convicted, they get deported. So they have those same rights as U.S. citizens do.
Well, I agree. Now, I know in this last term, there was a case about the EPA and whether they can control emissions and to what extent they should be able to. And so I wanted to ask all of you also, are there issues that are so important that we should forego our constitutional rights for them? For instance, the pandemic. For instance, climate change. There are those who believe climate change is, and that's what they look at this EPA case and say, well, climate change is so important, it shouldn't be even judged by the Supreme Court. They shouldn't have a say in it because it's that important.
So are we just going to keep creating asterisks on when the Constitution doesn't apply?
Right. Well, that's what's
going to happen.
Emergency after emergency.
Yeah, everything is going to be a political emergency to where you will have no Constitution if you let that happen.
And that's the problem, because Congress isn't doing its job, and the people aren't really getting involved in the way that they need to vote officials who are going to pay attention. And this is nonpartisan. This is complete nonpartisan. We really have to have issue politics where people come out and they say what they support, and then they have to be consistent about it. But they also have to be willing to understand that there are issues that affect all of us.
Well, when you say that that Congress kind of doesn't do anything, and so does that mean that these agencies can then do it, Attorney Tomei?
Well, so I think we live in Illinois.
Yes.
As I checked.
Good point. Good point.
Different governors and states have addressed the pandemic in different ways. Our governor here just so happens to have enacted the emergency proclamation after emergency proclamation.
I think we're still working under.
I think he's still. Yeah, I think we're still
we
working.
We are. It hasn't expired yet.
So I would imagine if history's any indication, he'll probably renew it again.
Yes.
He seems to be lessening it on each step of the way, but it's
because we're certain there's going to be another variant.
Right.
It's right around the corner.
But the issue was, especially with schools, and how the General Assembly delegated its legislative authority to the governor, to the executive, through the Emergency Powers Act. And the question is, why did the legislature not have a say? These are elected representatives. Now, not everybody voted for the governor, but people who voted for their specific representatives, those people have been deprived of a voice in policy with respect to addressing how to manage the pandemic. And it's a huge problem, and that's just a state level.
But then doesn't these powers become a dictatorship, which is what the Constitution was trying to keep us from?
That's right.
But again, let's talk about climate change, because there are those who believe that climate change is such an issue that our constitutional rights really don't pertain to this, because it's a global problem, and that we need to rein in our constitutional rights to solve this problem that they see, and that people see that problem. I don't know. What do you think, Attorney Dixler?
Well, I think that as far as climate change is concerned, the Congress has to come up with some reasonable consensus about what's going on. They can't pretend it's not happening. If there's science involved, they got to take a step back and not be so partisan about it. We can't be tribal about issues that affect all of us and pretend, oh, well, it was going to happen anyway. If there's something we could do about it to prevent things from happening, I think that sometimes we've got to just take a step back and not look at what we're there to do as a congressperson or as a senator. So it's very tough because you're stuck in the situation of some particular outspoken person dictating and people saying, yeah, the Levian mind theory, whether it's on one side or the other, and just feeling like you have to fall in place, the whip idea.
Well, you mentioned science. And I saw a senator was saying just yesterday or the day before that, well, these senators, they don't know anything about this. And so we have to leave it to the scientists. And that's what the administrators are, EPA. They know better.
That's not it. I think what the issue really is that we have to take a majority of established science, when we have a theory, more seriously. And Congress really has to bring these people in who really know what they're talking about. There's always going to be someone who's going to be a naysayer. But if the majority of the people who are out there who know the subject are saying, here's where it's at and here's why, they have to listen to the why. Why are these people saying this? What are they doing? And decide, where are we going to be on this issue? Are we going to be on the issue that really makes the most sense? And that's tough, because if we don't make sense about this or make sense of it, we're going to have more serious trouble.
Okay, so are we on the consensus that the government should make that decision and not administrators?
The Congress should make the decision.
Congress is the government. Yeah. Okay, so that's a good place to pick it up on the other side. I think this is a huge issue now with the EPA this decision that just came out, and of course global warming is all the rage, and we're going to talk about that on the other side. Join us, won't you, on AM 560, The Answer. Too important to leave to the people.
The people are stupid.
Sometimes it's not the people who are stupid. It's the interest. And again, you have to look at the interest they're doing this, because if you have a majority of businesses that are saying do this, and you have one business that's going to throw all their apples into it and say don't do this,
that's special interest. That's not interest. That's special
interest. You got minority interest.
Well,
that's special interest.
Money talks.
Right. Which is what it is now.
Yeah. I think the pandemic and what we've done during the pandemic is going to be a study for the next 20 years. Okay. I hope it doesn't take that long, because we need to really.
They said that in 1919, 1917 with the so-called Spanish flu, which wasn't the Spanish flu; it was really American flu. But what do we know about it?
But this whole misinformation stuff that comes out of that, and again the rules, and this was a senator who was saying that we're just not smart enough. We need to leave it to them. That's a senator who said that. I forget who
we're
it
not
was.
Smart
what
enough
it was.
To leave it to who was it?
What was it with Elizabeth Warren? I believe that said this.
Agency.
That we have, because these things are so complicated that we can't understand them, so we have to leave it to the agencies, because that's where the experts are. And let's be honest, our government agencies aren't full of experts.
Here's the challenge. The fact is that Congress doesn't want to listen to anything. So if they're not going to listen to anything, her defense mechanism is saying something that really doesn't jive with the law.
Josh, is this the last segment?
Sorry. Before we get on, I wanted to mention, because I have at least a I don't want to say this on the record on the podcast,
but we're always on the podcast.
Uh-oh. Are we?
Yeah, we
always are.
Oh, okay.
Well, you got some, is it controversial?
I don't think it's controversial per se. Mm-hmm. I mean, so I don't know if you gentlemen
I just want you to understand.
I'm one of your elected representatives.
Yeah.
I serve at the College of Lake County Board of Trustees.
I knew that.
You knew that.
Okay.
So. This idea of people running through these election cycles and having some kind of expectation to govern on policy, when you have administrators who are in place, who are the experts on fiscal responsibility or health policy, okay, it's so difficult to parse through and come to an informed decision. And if we're going to rely just so deferentially on the experts, at what point are we no longer a representative democracy?
Agreed.
We're just relying on authority.
People don't have the time, or they don't make the time. I think that's part of the challenge, is that they delegate. And sometimes, in some situations, you have to delegate, and you have to depend on people.
Well, you brought up Attorney Dixler. You brought up the idea that we need to and it's true, we do need experts. One of the problems, though, is that when we only hear from one side of the expert, and I think the pandemic is a great example of this, because anybody who disagreed, for instance, when they talked about therapy, instead of and that was all these. And I'm not a big medical guy, but about these certain treatments that would lower the death rate that were barred from discussion because everybody wanted I'm talking about the government and those who are big money, because that's the pharmaceutical companies who made billions.
Well, the big thing that's important is if you were me, and I don't know if you were like me or not, but if I'm ill, I want to be treated by someone who's a specialist, somebody who knows what's going on. I don't want to be treated for a COVID problem by someone who's an orthopedic surgeon. I want someone who knows it. He may know a little bit about it, but if I'm going to get treated, I want to have a specialist like you.
I agree.
If I want to have a tax attorney, I want you. I don't want the jack of all trades.
I want
Giddy you. I want Giddy you to do my tax.
This is our final segment. I'm going to give you each a couple of minutes. Talk what you want to talk about. You want to tell us about what you do too, because I want to make sure that people, if they need you, they can find you. But give us the final word. I'll give you the final word, okay? And we only have a couple of minutes, so don't take it all, okay? Let's do it, Josh.
And now, back to the Trust Radio Network on AM 560. The Answer. Real conversations with some of the most trusted professionals in Chicagoland. Once again, here's attorney Stephen A. Leahy.
Welcome back. I have just found out that this is our final segment. It goes so quickly because I'm giddy.
Giddy. And you know what you haven't done? Lollygagged at all.
I haven't lollygagged at all. So we only have a couple of minutes, and so I want each of these attorneys to have a final word. Let's start with Attorney Tomei. Your final words. So,
again, Robert Tomei. I've partnered at a general practice in Central Lake County in Libertyville. I, for my part of the practice, generally engage in taking cases related to consumer rights, business litigation. I've found myself now taking a segue back and related to the topic of the day, constitutional law and civil rights. And that's really what I want to focus on moving forward with my practice. So Stephen, I wanted to thank you for bringing me, inviting me and having me on. These gentlemen are seasoned veterans.
That's a nice way of saying we're old.
You guys know your stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's go to Attorney Dixler.
Well, as I said, my name's Kevin Dixler, and I've been practicing immigration law since 1993. A lot of what I do is federal.
Boy, you are old.
Just teasing. I know, Steve.
He has more hair than you. You know that, right?
I understand. I'm old too. So
there you go. So anyway, the bottom line for me is that we have a situation of laws and of decisions. And as attorneys, we have to look at those when we're representing our clients. And sometimes we don't always like what we see, but we have to be completely objective. It's always important to find an attorney, though, who's going to put the time in. And sometimes when you're talking to someone about something as complicated as immigration, you want to get a roadmap before. So I think it's important in my practice, given the complications as we've talked about in the recent Supreme Court decisions, to get an idea. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these issues. They're certainly sometimes controversial, but sometimes we have a lot in common. We have a lot of common ground. We have to sit down and talk about them.
About the final word.
No, that's you. You get the final word.
That's right.
It is your show. Remember, I gave it back to you last week.
That's right. There you go.
Nishay, Sanan. I do federal criminal defense work all over the country, extradition work internationally, securities fraud, and some other areas that overlap. Steve and I work together sometimes on tax matters, the civil side him, the criminal side me. I just want to say this was enjoyable because we have three different opinions and your opinion that you didn't give, according to you. So this has been an enjoyable time. This is the first time we've done a panel together.
It has,
and I just want to thank you, gentlemen, for everything you had to contribute. And I think we should do this again sometime.
Well, this was our first panel. I had a lot of fun. I was giddy because this is what I like to do. And you guys are all trusted professionals, been on the show before. I wanted to, these are important issues. They're everywhere. Everywhere you read now is about the Supreme Court and where it's leading us. And that's why I wanted to talk about it today. And I'm so glad that you guys could join us. If any of the listeners have an issue, I didn't get a chance to get the. We maybe give us your telephone number, Attorney Tomei.
847-549-0600.
And your website?
LAWJTLG.com.
And you, Attorney Sanan?
312-692-0360, and it's Sanan Law, SANANLAW.com.
Kevin Dixler, myself, 312-588-0500. My website is at my last name, Dixler.com. And you can find me on TikTok if you want to at KDixler.
Not dancing.
Not dancing.
Not dancing.
So again, thanks so much, gentlemen. It was a lot of fun. It went too fast. I know we did two weeks, and we could do 2 more. It was a lot of fun, and I want to thank you so much for taking the time and making this a success. I could do better at being a moderator, and I'll work on it next time. But obviously, there's going to be more issues. Love to have you guys involved in it. Remember, if you're looking for an attorney, get a trusted professional. That's what we have here at the Trust Radio Network. We have trusted professionals, people you can trust when you're making important decisions. And again, lawyers, when you're hiring your attorney, get a trusted professional. So give us a call, 312-664-6649. Go to chicagotaxteam.com. Thanks again for joining us. See you next week on AM 560, The Answer.
All right.
Okay, Josh, do my favorite thing.
Thank you for being a friend. Watching our podcast till the very end.
Thanks, guys, again. And I really had a lot of fun, and I hope you did too.
Thanks for having us.
Okay.
Thanks for having us.